13 nights, 13 knocks, and 13 pairs of eyes darker than any pupil you'd ever seen. I don't believe in ghosts, at least that's what I tell myself. But after reading dozens of accounts from people who swore they were just ordinary folks going about ordinary nights, something in me shifted. Call it curiosity, call it the dread you get when a pattern refuses to be dismissed. Tonight, I'm sharing 13 submitted encounters with what people online call black-eyed kids. Encounters that begin like a trivial knock at the door and end with a memory you can't scrub out. These are all reported experiences, collected from forum posts, emails, and messages sent to the channel. Some names are withheld or replaced with handles to protect anonymity. Some accounts are edited for clarity or length. I stayed skeptical while I read them. I hope you stay skeptical too. But listen closely, because detail after detail begins to fit together in a way that's hard to ignore. If you like long-form, deep-dive horror like this, hit subscribe. There's more where this came from. The first submission, penned by someone who calls themselves House Sitter 2017, starts small. A weekend house sit in a leafy suburb, a storm rolling in late on a Saturday. They were halfway through a book, the living room lamp casting a pool of yellow light, when the first knock came. It was polite at first, 3 light taps like someone testing the wood. They walked to the door, peered through the peephole, and saw 2 kids standing on the porch, drenched despite the covered entrance, hair plastered to their faces, dark hooded jackets. The narrator described the weather, cold, the rain heavy enough to feather across the porch light, and the smell of wet fabric. When they opened the door a crack, one of the kids looked straight at them, and the narrator remembered their throat tightening at the sight. It wasn't just dark eyes, it was an absence, like someone had painted over the iris and the sclera with ink, and the eyes swallowed the light. The kid's voice was soft, almost friendly. "Can we come in? We're cold." That simple phrase, the narrator said, felt wrong. They offered to get a towel, to step outside and call someone, but the child's insistence was measured and slow, not pleading. The narrator closed the door and locked it, their hands shaking. They sat with the phone, considered calling the police, decided against it. Who calls police on kids? After 20 minutes, the knocks stopped. When they looked through the peephole again, the porch was empty. The narrator slept with the lights on and woke 3 hours later to wet footprints that led up to the door and stopped, like someone had been erased mid-step. They never could explain the footprints. That image, the footprints ending as if the world put a comma there, was what kept him awake for nights. The second submission came from Van Driver 92, a delivery driver who worked late routes around a strip mall on the outskirts of town. He was used to odd requests, tips for directions, people asking to warm up in the van because their car had broken down. One night in November, he pulled into a quiet lot at 1 in the morning to sort packages. He remembered the hush, how the fluorescent lights hummed, the parking lot empty except for his van and the dull glow of the Storcon signs. He saw 2 teenagers sitting on the curb at the far end. They looked like they'd been waiting for a bus that never came. Jeans, cheap sneakers, hood pulled up. He waved, thinking they'd appreciate a ride. When he stalled the engine and opened the passenger door, one of them climbed in without asking and sat perfectly still, hands folded, head bowed. The other knocked on the back door and asked, "Do you have a phone? Ours died." The driver's voice went small when he told the story. He had a bad feeling but couldn't place it. There was something about how coordinated they were, their timing precise, like actors rehearsed to the same silent cue. When he glanced over at the kid in the passenger seat, he said the air went thin. The eyes were pure black, like someone had removed the whites entirely. The kid didn't blink. The driver asked where they lived, who to call, anything to anchor the moment in ordinary detail. "We're just waiting," the kid answered. The driver locked the doors, stayed in the van with the heater running until he convinced himself it was safer inside. He finally drove off, heart pounding. When he checked the rearview mirror later, the back seat was empty, and there were no footprints around the van to mark where they'd been. He also later found a camera from the strip mall's exterior that had recorded the lot that night. The footage showed his van parked, the lights on, and then 2 figures near it. But in the footage, the faces were blurred in an odd way, and out-of-place darkness where their eyes should have been. The van driver submitted a still from the camera, claiming it, but asked that the clip not be publicly shared. He told me he never did night deliveries again. Story 3 came from night shift EMT who worked at a small-town emergency clinic.
They were used to strange hours and stranger callers, but one night a welfare check turned into something they couldn't explain. A man called, voice quivering, asking someone to check on 2 kids he'd seen near his barn. The narrator drove out to a remote lane, rain slicking the road, horses a low chorus in the fields, and found a scene that felt ordinary enough. 2 teenagers standing under the dim light of a porch lamp, soaked, leaning against the railing. When they approached, the kids asked, in unison, if they could use a phone. The EMT's chest tightened, and their partner, who was normally unshakable, put a hand on the radio like for comfort. The kids weren't dirty. They looked almost too clean for being in the rain, their clothes clinging in an odd way.
Then one of the neighbor's dogs started to whine and refused to come near. The EMT told me animals are weird predictors. Dogs go wild around things that make no human sense. The kids spoke in small, practiced sentences. One of them said, "We just need to call someone, please." The EMT offered a blanket instead. One of the kids' heads tilted, and when the crescent of light hit their face, the EMT said they felt a coldness like a door opening onto nothing. They left after the EMT refused to let them into the house. An hour later, when they drove by to check, the porch light was on and the swings were moving as if someone had just been sitting there. The neighbor insisted all night that kids had been seen for weeks but vanished whenever anyone tried to engage. The EMT's report concluded with an admission they'd slept with the porch light on for a week, and with a note that if you think this is just prank kids, count the times the animals refused contact. The 4th account, submitted by Porchlight01, was quieter, domestic. A mother putting her newborn to sleep heard a tapping on the front window just after midnight. The house was a modest bungalow on a tree-lined street, and the child was light sleeping in the next room. She walked to the window, heart thudding, and saw 2 children standing on the strip of grass outside looking up at her. They were small, maybe 11 or 12, both with their hoods zipped up, rain dripping from the hems of their jackets. The mother said their faces were pale, but the part that stopped her breath was the eyes, liquid, total blackness that made her own reflection in the glass look like a ghost. One of them placed a palm against the window, and she could see the skin was cold and clammy against the glass. "Can you open the back door? We need to warm up," one whispered. The mother felt her chest fill with the primal need to protect the baby. She told them to go home. The kids didn't argue, they just watched for a long time, unwavering. She called the husband, who came home. By the time they both peered out, there was no one on the sidewalk. They found damp marks on the planter stones below the window, like fingertips that had pressed and then disappeared. The mother said she started locking the back door even during daylight. She'd wake and see the porch light on, or the driveway gate moved slightly, as if someone had stood there listening. She didn't leave the baby alone for weeks. Between these first 4 stories, a pattern emerges that readers noticed. The threshold, the porch, the van door, the window, serves as a stage where ordinary courtesy turns into menace. The requests are always simple: a phone, shelter to be let in, and the eyes, when they reveal themselves, are the defining signature.
At first glance, you might call it an elaborate prank, or the trick of a mind under stress. But when multiple independent witnesses describe the same absences in the eye, and when animals react before humans do, skepticism becomes a colder thing. The 5th account, Traffic Stop Reported, is a reported sighting from a commuter on an intercity highway. The submitter didn't want their name used, so they sent it as Commute Anon. It was a foggy autumn evening. They were driving home from a late shift when they noticed 2 figures on an on-ramp, huddled by the guardrail. They slowed down and offered to pick them up, feeling foolishly noble on the empty asphalt. The taller one climbed into the passenger seat and leaned forward, hands folded, not quite making eye contact. The other tapped the side door with their knuckles. "Can you take us somewhere? We're supposed to be with our aunt," the voice said. The commuter describes glancing into the rearview mirror and losing their breath. The eyes were like 2 holes burned out of a photograph. The kid didn't smile. The commuter turned up the radio and drove on, heart banging. When they reached for their phone to report what had happened, they opened the map and realized a stretch of their route had no record of where they could have let anyone out safely. No exits, no lights, only fog and road. Later, the commuter checked dashcam footage and sent a frame where the 2 figures appeared as silhouettes, but with the area where their faces should be rendered in a flat, unnatural black. They labeled it reported and chose not to release the full clip. The commuter said they can't bring themselves to drive that route at night anymore. Story 6 is smaller, but it lingers. Submitted by Night Owler, it was a late-night dog walk around the block. The narrator loved quiet streets and the way the air smelled after a summer thunderstorm. They took the shortcut that hugged the cemetery fence and hot off-leash, an old golden retriever who never strayed far. Midway down the path, something made the dog stop dead. The dog's hair rose along its spine, and it turned to look toward a grouping of houses. The narrator followed the dog's line of sight and saw 2 kids standing under a street lamp, soaking wet though the rain had stopped an hour before.
They called to the kids in a friendly tone. The kids turned but didn't move toward them. One of them raised a hand as if in a casual wave, slow and deliberate. The narrator felt a cold pressure in their chest and noticed how the streetlight bounced off the kids' heads except where their faces should have been. The eyes were all shadow. They hurried home, the dog close at their heel. After that night, the dog refused to be alone in the yard. It would follow the narrator to the window and watch the street until dawn. Animals, people told me, have no superstition, only instincts.
When enough animals react the same way across enough stories, you start to wonder whether instincts are trying to tell us something the conscious mind can't parse. By now, the thread is visible. Damp clothing, request to be let in or to use a phone, black eyes that are not reflective, animals as early alarms, footsteps that start and stop without source. The early encounters stay largely on the edges, porches, van seats, sidewalks. They unsettle, but they can be dismissed as a prank or as sleep-deprived imagination. The accounts that follow push those edges inward. The 7th submission came from a college student living in a basement apartment, submitted as Basement Room 04. It was a classic late-night study session. Soup, laptop glow, the muffled hum of the radiator. They were up at 3 a.m., scribbling references, when something scraped at the basement door. A slow, deliberate knock that seemed to follow the rhythm of their pulse. The narrator opened the door a crack and saw a pair of kids on the stairs, their jackets slick with rain as if they'd just climbed out of the gutter. One of them was small, holding a cheap toy plushie that looked soaking and limp. The smaller child looked at the narrator and said, "We need to come inside. It's cold." The narrator said they felt paralyzed, not physically, but a mental stickiness that made their voice sound far away. They told the kids to go away. The kids repeated their request, this time in the same monotone voice, and with a stare that the narrator compared to 2 tiny wells of emptiness. The narrator slammed the door and bolted it, sat down on the couch shaking until dawn, and later found finger marks on the doorframe where something had pressed and left an oily residue. They moved out 2 months later. They couldn't shake the feeling that they had almost done the wrong thing by mistake, that any small maps might let those faces through. The 8th story, submitted by Night Clerk, was a 20-minute encounter in a motel lobby. The narrator was working the front desk at 3 in the morning when 2 teenagers walked in, soaked to the bone, and asked if there was any vacancy. The clerk's instincts said no. Management discouraged late check-ins. But it's a motel. Turns of fate have a way of bending rules. The clerk gave them a key, and the kids smiled with the ease of people who knew exactly how far they could push. About an hour later, one of the regular guests called down, complaining of noise coming from the adjacent room. The clerk knocked, heard nothing, and opened the door a fraction. Inside, the room was tidy and unoccupied, the beds untouched. The adjoining corridor security camera, later retrieved and viewed, showed the kids entering but not leaving. The footage also had moments where the camera's exposure shifted, making the corner of the frame go dark.
The clerk said that the hotel kept the snippet on file and that they still get chills when they watch the 2 figures on the screen standing perfectly still in the doorway while the hallway lights flicker. The kids didn't ask to stay long. They didn't speak much. They simply waited. The 9th account came from Farm Lane Submitter, a small narrative threaded with rural sounds, crickets thick as whispers, a low wind that pushed hay bales toward the moon. The witness was out feeding horses, the animals restless in the stable, when 2 children appeared at the end of the lane, small silhouettes against the cornfield. The horses reacted violently, rearing and refusing to be led, and one of the farmer's dogs wailed. The kids walked up the lane with measured steps and stopped at the stable door, looking in. "We need to come in," one said. The farmer, a practical person, untroubled by superstition, had a rifle on the shelf, not out of violence, but for foxes and the like. He told them to go on, to get home. The children didn't emote, they merely repeated the line, their voices matching each other. The farmer barked that he was calling the sheriff, and they turned and walked away as if someone had given them a cue. He later checked the security camera and found that at the moment they reached the gate, the camera had a static burst and then an image of empty fields. When he went back in the morning to check the fence line, he found hoof prints near the gate, and closer to the porch, 2 shallow indentations, as if something small had stood there and then ceased to be. These rural accounts add an extra layer. Isolation makes response slower, and animals become witnesses. They also underscore how these encounters don't stick to any single geography. Towns, suburbs, farms, they appear wherever thresholds exist. The 10th submission is one that shook me because it included a 911 clerk's voice in the chain of evidence. Submitted as dispatcher report claimed, the witness was a worried father who called in the middle of the night after his wife saw 2 kids at the back door asking to use their phone. The dispatcher took notes and asked standard questions.
How many? What's their age? Are they violent? The husband said the dispatcher sounded skeptical, but logged the call. When officers arrived, the kids were gone. The family had a Ring-style camera at the back porch. The video showed two figures moving into view, stopping, and then standing motionless while the porch light glowed. When the family replayed the segment, they noticed that in the frames where the kids turned to the camera, the eyes registered as pure black shapes, no reflection, no white. The dispatcher later made a notation in the log, and the officer said they'd had other similar calls in the area that month. What unsettled the father most was the tone in the dispatcher's voice when she had to write it up. Tired, like someone who'd seen the same entitled plea too many times.
Whether that meant prank kids or something else, the father couldn't say. He only knew that the next few nights the family took shifts sleeping by the doors. Where the accounts shift from creepy to chilling is where the phenomena cross into the private sanctum, inside the house, at the stairwell, in the living room while children are sleeping nearby. The next clusters of stories press against that line. The 11th piece, submitted as House Guest 87, came from someone who was house-sitting for an elderly neighbor. It began like the first, a gentle knock at night. This time, however, there was no rain, no fog, just the ordinary quiet of a cul-de-sac. When the house-sitter opened the door, two small kids stood across the walkway. "We're lost," one said. "Can we come in?" The house-sitter moved to call the neighbor. The kids stepped forward, and that same cold, patient insistence slipped into their tone. One of them extended a hand as if to take comfort, and when the house-sitter recoiled, the kids smiled in a way the narrator described as wrong, less expression, more ecstatic curve of mouth. They left when the house-sitter slammed the door, but later the neighbor confided that she'd found glittering wet specks on the steps that looked like light but felt oily to the touch. Her granddaughter, who'd spent the night, woke in tears and insisted that someone had been watching her from the landing. The house-sitter admitted the bravado of youth evaporated, replaced by a vigilance that lasted for weeks. The 12th story, submitted by RV Stop Anonymous, is a roadside encounter that starts with a family stuck at a rest stop. It's easy to imagine being exhausted and relieved to find a safe place, but an hour after they settled, two kids wandered up asking if they could warm up by the fire. The family let them sit at the edge of their picnic table. The father later said the kids' posture was odd, too still, too deliberate. When one of his daughters asked why they were out so late, the kid looked right at her and asked if she could come with them, just for a while. She froze. The family got up and asked the kids to leave, and they did, walking toward the tree line and dissolving into the dusk. That same night, the child's drawing she'd made for school, a picture of her family, had a new figure in it the next morning. Two black circles where the eyes should be, so dark the crayon had scraped the paper surface. By now, the accounts are accumulating in an interlinked pattern. Parents, drivers, night workers, people alone at home, none immune. The requests remain consistent, the behavior identical enough to suggest more than coincidence, yet the explanations offered by witnesses vary. Some think it's kids playing elaborate games, others suspect hoaxes, some speak of superstition. A few come at the problem from a different angle and describe physiological effects: nausea, headaches, a weird tug at the gut. That sensation, several people said, was the most persuasive evidence that something else was happening. It felt like the room had been put under a lid for a moment, and the air thinned. The accounts I've read, these first dozen or so, stop short of proving anything. They are testimonies, not trials. But they stitch together a map of behavior that cannot be easily dismissed. Thresholds, insistence, those eyes, animals that notice first, movement that vanishes. And as the stories progress, a handful of witnesses describe a more personal erosion of certainty. Skeptics whose disbelief falls away not in a single dramatic conversion, but in the slow accumulation of detail that refuses to be explained away. One of those witnesses, submitted by Skeptic No More, was someone who began as a rationalist, prone to sarcasm at the mention of haunting stories. Their encounter stands out because it erodes belief slowly and leaves the person permanently changed. They were alone in a remote cabin, snow tilting down outside, generator humming. It was the kind of place where you'd expect silence, not knocks. At midnight, a faint rap on the door broke into rhythm, 3 short, then 1 long. The person got up, annoyed, and opened a crack to peer out. 2 kids stood on the stoop, soaked in a way that made no sense in the freezing air, their breath not visible in the cold. They always asked, to come inside. The skeptic said they offered language instead. "Where are you from? Who are you with?" The kids repeated their line, "We need to come in." The skeptic felt then a physical pressure in the chest, like hands bracing against a squeeze. They slammed the door, bolted it, and sat breathing until dawn. Afterwards they told friends who laughed and said it was probably kids from a nearby lodge playing a prank.
Weeks later, the skeptic caught himself checking the locks in daylight, listening for a sound that once meant nothing and now had the weight of warning. It's the small, persistent changes, anxiety in the grocery aisles, a reluctance to go out after dark, that become the collateral of such encounters. And here I have to pause. There's more to come, and escalation as promised, into the house and the intimate spaces where a knock at the door is not an interruption, but an event that changes the inside of a life. In the next set of accounts, people describe footsteps in hallways after they have locked the doors, voices whispering that sound like small radios tuned to static, and one or two accounts that claim partial footage captured on doorbells or security cameras. Some of those submissions are corroborated by multiple witnesses. Others remain stubbornly alone, leaving you to weigh possibility against memory. The question that stays with me is simple and ugly. If these are not prank kids, and if they are not a shared hallucination, what mechanism could produce such uniformity of behavior, such a consistent temptation to cross thresholds?
Before we push the door wider into those darker rooms, remember that these are reported experiences. They are not evidence in a courtroom of paranormal activity. They are stories told by people who woke to a feeling of wrongness and decided to put words to it. But if you're still with me, if your skepticism hasn't finalized into dismissal, then listen, because what follows digs into the nights where people were not watching from porches, but from inside their own living rooms, and where the knock doesn't stop at the frame, but scratches at the sanctity of a home. One more thing before we go on. If any of these accounts resonates with something you've seen or experienced, there's an urge to cling to explanation, to find comfort in logic. The collection I'm curating includes a few reports that have snippets of camera footage or dispatch logs attached. Those are labeled as reported or claimed when the witness shared them. I won't be showing or airing private footage here, but the presence of such corroborations in a minority of accounts is worth noting. It doesn't answer the questions, it complicates them. Now, imagine a quiet street, a house with the television on low, a child upstairs, and a tap on the glass. Imagine the air doing something in your chest that your words can't frame. That is where we go next, into the house, into the small hours where your own thresholds start to feel porous. The next story is from someone who woke to a sound inside their home and found an answer staring at them, an answer that left them sleeping with lights on for months and gave them the kind of worry that gets under your skin and decides to stay. They woke to a sound they couldn't place, not a knock, not quite a creak, something small and deliberate, like a fingernail tracing the inside of a glass. The house was the kind of house where sounds lived, settling boards, the furnace sighing, the refrigerator's soft churn. But this noise had the cadence of a person at the threshold of a room. Submitted as Living Room Submitted, the narrator was alone that night, partner away on a work trip, the baby asleep upstairs. The television hummed in the corner, an island of blue light. At first they thought a raccoon or a neighbor's stray had knocked something loose outside. Then the sound came again, closer this time, along the hallway that led from the front door to the bedrooms. They say ordinary fear is sharp and immediate. This was different, an accumulation of small wrongnesses that made the world feel slightly off its axis. They stood, telling themselves to be practical. A flashlight, the phone, logical tools for an illogical noise. They eased toward the hallway, moving like someone underwater, each step a careful statistic. At the bedroom doorway, the sound stopped. The narrator's reflection in the darkened door window looked back at them, wide-eyed, face lit by the TV's ghostlight. Then, from down the hall, a small voice, measured and soft, said, "Can we come in?" "We're cold." The voice might have belonged to a child. The phrasing was childlike enough. But the way it filled the hall, so calm and so precise, rewired their instincts. They turned the corner and saw, framed in the thin pool of the hallway lamp, two figures standing just inside the front entry, as if they'd come through the door without opening it. Their clothes clung as if damp, their hair dark and flat. At first glance, the faces were pale and unremarkable, almost too clean. Then the narrator saw the eyes and felt as though the air itself had been replaced with something heavier. The blackness wasn't a shadow cast by poor light. It had edges, a defined absence where iris and sclera should be, and it absorbed the hallway lamp's glow instead of reflecting it. One of the children extended a hand, small and steady, as if offering reassurance. "We just need to get warm," they said, again not pleading but stating a fact.
The narrator's immediate reaction was the kind everyone expects in stories, a protective instinct focused on the baby upstairs. They stepped between the figures and the stairs, voice high as they told him to go away. The kids didn't move for a long moment. The silence stretched until it had weight. Then they turned as though on some quiet cue and walked back toward the door without looking at the narrator. By the time the phone alarm had finished a jittery ringtone, the porch was empty. After the fact, there were details that didn't make sense. Damp footprints trailing up to the door, then stopping a foot short. The faint smell of ozone and something metallic in the hallway. The baby waking at 3 a.m. and babbling about black eyes before falling back asleep. The narrator replayed the night for weeks, how the figures had not tried to push past them, how their language held an unnerving steadiness, how the animals in the house, a cat who usually greeted visitors, had fled to the bedroom and refused to leave the bed for days. It's the intimate ones that get under your skin. When an encounter occurs where the thresholds stop being architectural and start being personal, where the hallway, the stairwell, the baby monitor become the stage, your sense of safety fractures in a way ordinary late-night strangeness never could. Living Room Submitted moved out a month later. They wrote near the end of their message, "It's the not knowing that stays, not horror exactly, but the certainty that something in the world has changed its rules." If the last account took place in the living room, the next one came to us as something anchored by technology, a clip, a timestamp, and the thin white logic of a doorbell camera. Doorbell camera reported arrived labeled and cautious. The family who submitted it asked that the raw footage not be shared widely. They sent it to corroborate what they saw and to let someone else listen to how a normal night can be rendered unreal. Their camera caught two figures walking onto the porch at 1:12 a.m.
The little timestamp in the corner moved like a metronome. At first, they appeared as silhouettes, two small bodies under the porch light. The clip showed them standing still, looking up at the lens for a long time. When the mother replayed the footage slow motion, she said the eyes looked wrong, like holes that had been filled with ink, absent of the specular flash you expect when light hits a pupil. What made this report stick in my mind wasn't just the footage itself, but how it intersected with human behavior. The family's son had autism. He'd long had a habit of drawing what he termed night friends when he couldn't sleep. The week after the figures appeared on the porch cam, the boy, who'd never named these friends aloud, folded a crayon drawing and pushed it to his mother. It was simple, stick figures, their eyes darkened to solid circles. He said, matter-of-factly, "They asked if my room was warm. They said they'd come in and be quiet." The mother checked 3 times that night, every lock, every bolt. She kept the baby monitor volume turned up and slept in the living room with the boy, both of them closer to the door than usual. The footage remained stored on the camera company cloud with a notation that read, simply, "unusual frames." A neighbor down the street later reported seeing 2 kids walking away from that house around the same time, figures that faded into the shadows of the hedges in a way she described as like steam vanishing. She didn't stop her car. She told herself it was nothing. What all of this does, footage, drawing, the child's spoken line, is complicate the neat division between witness and artifact. Video can be manipulated, kids draw strange things, neighbors misremember. But when independent channels converge, the human recollection, the mechanical capture, the child's unprompted drawing, it becomes harder for plain skepticism to reduce it to a single comfortable explanation. After that, I received several shorter submissions that clustered around the theme of stairs and voices. A tenant who heard a child's humming on the stair landing at 2 in the morning, a homeowner who found fingerprints on the inside of a bedroom window that were oily and cold to the touch, a late-night babysitter who swore she heard a small whisper through the baby monitor saying the child's name. These were briefer fragments of nights long and sleepless. Alone they might be disregarded. Together they formed a chorus. One of the accounts, Stair Whisper Claim, was told by someone who lived in a duplex and prided themselves on rational explanations. They were the sort of person who could always find the weather report for a sound, the builder's note for a creak. But the night this happened, their rational map failed. Locked in their bedroom, they heard a soft scuff on the stairs, like soft-soled shoes taking measured steps. Then a voice, so close it was as if a child leaned against the closed door. "Please, we need to come in."
The voice wasn't raised. It wasn't pleading. It was as if someone recounted a fact. They needed warmth. The writer asked themselves if it was a prank, a neighbor's kid. They opened the door just enough to peer down the stairwell and saw 2 small shapes at the bottom, faces turned up toward the doorway. It is worth repeating, they did not ram the door or press it. They stood as if in expectation. When the lights flickered, one of them tilted their head and smiled in what the narrator called a mechanical way. The narrator slammed the door, locked it, and sat awake all night, enumerating possibilities like a way to ward off panic. In the morning, they found dusty little prints on the inside step leading to the door, too small for an adult, too precise for a normal child's sturdy footsteps, like someone had stood there and exhaled. Two details recur in these close-quarters stories and refuse to be incidental. First, the insistence is never loud. It's the assertive economy of a request that assumes compliance. Second, the aftermath almost always includes an uncanny trace: prints, small marks, a toy left where no toy had been. Those traces are never proof. They are, at best, prompts, evidence of a touch on the boundary between normal and otherwise. By now you might expect a climactic confrontation, windows shattered, police called, scripture recited, and the records I read avoid such melodrama. The most disturbing cases are quieter, domestic, the slow erosion of a life's background certainty. Consider the account submitted as Night Watcher-Family, a story with a handful of corroborating elements that pushed the phenomenon from anecdote into something that local reports tagged as pattern. This was a family who ran a small corner store and lived above it. One winter night, the parents were downstairs closing up when their neighbor rushed in, pale as snow, to say his child had seen someone at the upstairs window. The family went up to check and found nothing at first. Then the mother, as she switched off the lamp in the bedroom, looked out and saw two tiny faces at the far corner of the alley, framed by the alley's puddles and cold light. She waved, thinking them kids seeking shelter. One of them looked over in reply and, to her complete horror, lifted a hand and tapped the window in a slow, deliberate pattern, 3 short, 1 long. The family called the police and filed a report. The responding officer took notes, asked questions, and later that week logged 2 additional calls from other residents in the neighborhood who described the same pattern, figures at thresholds, the same rhythm of knocks. A patrolman who'd grown up in the area told them off the record that he'd seen such clusters before in other parts of town and that they always left the officers with a taste of something unsettled, but never an arrestable moment.
The family's front-facing security camera recorded the alley that night and showed 2 figures lingering, then seeming to walk away, only to vanish at a patch of fog that rolled in from the river. That footage was labeled unexplained in the police log. What's important here isn't the potential for proof. Police logs and dashcam clips can be messy, but the way institutions respond. A tired notation, a file with odd calls written in the margins. Those institutional footnotes crop up in several submissions, giving the collection a kind of administrative weight. They're not the same as evidence of the supernatural, but they suggest pattern, not just isolated flare-ups in someone's imagination, but repeated events that generate recordable reactions from neighbor, officer, dispatcher, store owner. One of the submissions that unsettled me most was brief and almost throwaway in tone. Submitted as small-town mailer, it read like one of those notes you tuck into a pocket and can't find later. A postal carrier on a rural route stopped and described 2 kids he'd seen at the mailbox under the new blue house. He'd been doing the route for years. He knew the dog that barked at delivery trucks and the old man who left milk at the porch. On that morning, he told the post office, he had found every single flag on the mailboxes down that lane raised, each one held as if in waiting. Where the blue house's flag should have been, someone had pushed it halfway up and left it trembling. The carrier reported nothing dramatic. The kids had walked out of a hedgerow at dusk, asked the carrier if they could wait for the mail because their mother expected a letter. When he looked, their eyes were black as a winter pond. He left the lane and reported it. The rural supervisor made a notation and asked him to chalk it up to his route's peculiarities. Small details like this, flags raised like sentinels, porch lights left on, damp swings still moving, accumulate. They form a kind of geography of unease. In different hands, they might be quaint local color. Strung together, they look like signs pointing to a phenomenon that does its work in polite language. May we come in? We're cold. We need to call someone. The requests read like a script, as if there's an instruction manual for how to unsettle a person without raising alarms that might mobilize the community. There's a story I haven't told yet that marks a turn for the tellers themselves. It's one of those accounts where the narrator begins as an arch skeptic and finishes with the slow, almost comical fatalism of someone who now double-checks bolts at sunset. You met this person earlier in passing, skeptic no more, the rationalist who spent weekends debunking myths and collecting counterexamples. Their report is long, careful, suspicious of every assumption. They were in a remote cabin, the kind where the generator's hum becomes a meter for time, snow beating at the eaves, silence thick as wool. At midnight, a pattern knocking began, 3 short, 1 long, a rhythm that recurred in several accounts. They opened the door and saw 2 children at the threshold, breath not visible in the cold. That little fact bothered them at the time. It bothered them later more. Skeptic No More asked their visitors simple questions, the kind of questions that make lies fall. Names, where they were heading, who they'd come with. The kids answered only with the refrain they'd said to so many other witnesses, "We need to come in." The skeptic notes that they slammed the door partly from fear, but mostly from a detached curiosity. What happens if you refuse a pattern? The answer, in their case, was a slow unraveling of certainties. They began to dream of doors left ajar. Awake, they found themselves scanning for dark pupils in faces at parties and avoiding isolated cabins on long weekends. They'd laughed at the genre, then the genre reached back, quiet and patient, and emptied their jokes. Skeptic No More's final paragraph is worth quoting in essence. There was no dramatic possession, no cinematic finale. There was a shift in the margins of life. Sleep now had a hedge of caution. A locked door felt like a promise rather than an afterthought. They concluded, "I don't know what they are. I only know I will not be alone on a dark road again." It's not a conversion so much as a reallocation of probability. What was once improbable now takes up residence in the list of possibilities. That reallocation, the slow redistribution of what we consider likely, is perhaps the most human cost of these encounters. It isn't flaming catastrophe. It's the adjusting of habits, the small precautions, the late-night check-ins that ripple out. People who told me their stories never demanded we believe them. They asked only that someone listen carefully, that the oddities be recorded somewhere outside their heads. And yet, even with all this, I kept returning to the question others asked me in emails. Why children? Why that false familiarity? Several witnesses offered tentative theories. A few suspected that the form of a child is strategic. Children provoke protection, lower the guard. Older mythologies describe tricksters who wore a child's shape to get close. Some contributors lean towards psychological or social explanations, mass hysteria, role-playing, elaborate hoaxes. Others whispered the more metaphysical speculation, but always as hypothesis, never as proof. One particularly quiet submission pushed at the edges of those explanations. Submitted as neighbor corroborates, it came from a block where multiple households reported similar encounters over a 2-week span. A retired couple who'd lived on the street for decades described several nights of faint knocking accompanied by the same 3 short, 1 long rhythm. Their account was corroborated by the neighbor across the street who heard the knock and watched from behind their curtain.
What the couple found the next morning was the oddest. A cluster of small, wet footprints on their porch that led to the edge, and then appeared to stop, as if whatever had left them had been removed from the world mid-stride. The neighbor took a picture and sent it to the couple. The two of them, both skeptical in their ways, sat with the images and decided they couldn't both be pranking each other for 2 whole weeks. The police locked their calls. The local paper printed a column about weird behavior in late-night teenagers. The column came with the usual columnists, some amused, some stern, some fearful. Nothing definitive emerged. But for the families on that block, nights gained an extra vigilance. It's tempting to look for narrative closure, to craft a tidy explanation in the last pages of a file. These stories don't arrive with receipts or moral clarity. Instead, they leave traces, a child's drawing, a ring notification, a dispatcher's sigh. The story's final cluster, the ones people sent me after the earlier accounts, tend to be the most intimate, the ones that shade into the private and stay there. One of those last accounts was sent by someone who stayed anonymous as Basement Light Listener. They were a single parent working second shift and had a child who fell asleep to the glow of a handheld nightlight. One night, the parent awakened to hear the child whispering about 2 kids by the back door. They checked the live view on the baby monitor and saw briefly a small figure moving in the dark near the slider, then a second figure following. They let themselves be pragmatic, an animal, a neighbor, an overactive imagination. Still, the child began to draw at school the next week and gave the parent a picture. 2 people at a door, circles for eyes, and a speech bubble that read, in a child's shaky letters, "We will come in." That child's certainty, the casual way they transcribed the event, was perhaps the most disturbing element. Children are both more honest about what they perceive and less equipped to rationalize it. When a child names something, it gains a potency adults often try to demote. The final story in the batch I want to leave you with is the one that lodged in my mind and refused to move. It came from a handle I hesitate to summarize, because the submission itself was spare and literary in a way that made each sentence feel like a cold coin. Midnight window. The witness lived in an old apartment and kept a plant on the cell. One night they awoke to a soft thudding against the glass and found pressed to the outside of the bedroom window 2 small faces looking in. One of them tapped the glass and mouthed the words, "We need to come in." But their lips didn't move like a person forming sounds. It was as if they were communicating a preset phrase. The narrator said they felt something in their chest, like an electric tug.
They lit a cigarette despite not being a smoker and watched, wildly conscious of the world outside their window. Then, as if folded by a change in wind, the two figures stepped away and melted into the alley's grease-lamped fog. The next morning, the narrator found two tiny wet smudges on the exterior ledge of the window. No prints walking off, nothing to explain the moisture. For weeks, they had nightmares of doors opening and of hands reaching in to switch off the light. Midnight Window closed their message with a line I can't shake. I used to think darkness was a place you walked through to get to the other side. Now I think sometimes darkness stands at your threshold and waits. It doesn't bang or shout. It asks politely to be invited inside. Politeness as weapon. It's a theme that recurs in almost every account, the form of a request used to test a boundary. When someone says, "let us in," the sentence contains more than itself. It contains an assumption of compliance, a pressure on social obligation, the potential to unmoor the person who hears it. The black-eyed kids in the testimonies seem to exploit that social muscle. You are taught to help, to take pity, to open the door. The narratives reveal a cruel kind of engineering. Use the child's face to disarm, the polite phrasing to create cognitive dissonance, the stillness to flatten the response time. What are we left to do with this? The collection I've read and curated is not evidence in a scientific sense. It is a catalog of human experience, reports from people who were awake at odd hours and found their nights changed. The safest stance is humility. Don't assume you've been given a map to the metaphysical. Don't assume malevolence where pranks may explain the facts. But also do not dismiss the toll, the sleeplessness, the extra checks, the parents who stop letting their kids answer the door. Those are real consequences. If you're hearing these stories and thinking like the tellers once did, skeptical, amused, perhaps even a little condescending, it's worth remembering how many of these accounts share the same threats. The repetition is the thing that makes a cluster of anecdotes into a pattern. When someone in Nebraska, a delivery driver on the outskirts of a Florida strip mall, a farmer in a field, and a parent in a suburban bungalow all describe the same oddities, the same black, unreflective pupils, the same measured request, it demands at least some attention. I've kept a private tally as I assembled these accounts. Porch, van, hall, camera, alleyway, sleeping child, dispatcher notes, animals that refuse contact, prints that stop at the doorstep. That list is not proof, it's a ledger, and it grows heavier with every report. Some of the stories were edited or condensed for pacing. Many of you sent in small fragments, and I grouped similar ones together to create clearer narratives. When I did, I labeled them as combined accounts so you knew what you were reading wasn't an attempted fabrication, but an editorial choice. What's striking is less the possibility of otherworldly explanation than the way these stories rearrange ordinary life into something precautionary. People begin to tell their lights to stay on. They do not answer quiet knocks. They film, they log, they add extra locks. And that behavioral shift is perhaps the only consistent outcome, a small restructuring of daily risk responses that can be measured not in sunlight, but in the hours people spend awake, checking. So where does that leave us? I don't have a tidy answer. I have patience for multiple hypotheses and little tolerance for easy certainties. These are testimonies, not trials. They should be met with respect, recorded with care, and analyzed without prejudice. If a pattern exists, and the evidence here leans that way, then the prudent response is caution and compassion. Watch the threshold, protect the vulnerable, document the oddities you see without shaming the person who experiences them. If any of what you've heard tonight rings a bell, a visit at a door you dismissed, a child's drawing you couldn't explain, a photo on your doorbell that left you cold, consider sending a submission. I read what people send me, and where plausible corroboration exists, I note it as reported. In this community, your account is data and also human testimony. Either way, it's worth preserving. Before I go, a final note. I promised 13 stories. Some of the accounts I've curated were individual and complete. Others were pieces folded together for clarity. If you count them in your head, you'll find 13 beats, 13 nights, 13 knocks, 13 moments when someone looked at a threshold and saw something they hadn't expected. They are small episodes, mostly without cinematic fury, but they accumulate like a pressure under a door.
And whether you read them with horror, with amusement, or with scientific skepticism, you'll notice one thing. A phrase repeats throughout like a refrain. We're cold. Can we come in? If you want more full-length collections like this and early access to episodes, join our patrons. Link below. Thank you to everyone who submitted. Thank you to the people who trusted me with their nights. Keep your doors locked. Keep an eye on your cameras. And if something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Sleep tight, if you can.